Hi there, my name is Tejas Dharamshi. I'm a senior security engineer at Netflix. So Netflix went global in 2016, where we started streaming content like in more than 190 countries. But when you think from an enterprise security lens, like what did this actually mean? So not only were we going to stream content in more than 190 countries, but when you think about from an employee and contractor perspective, that population was going to see an equal amount of expansion, which meant like we would have new office locations, more remote workers, and these remote workers might be either connecting from home or from any public Wi-Fi. We started making more original content than ever before, both here in the US and all across the globe. And people who are actually working on these productions, we started making applications that are primarily focused for our production use cases, which meant people who are working on our productions, they would need access to these applications. They're going to be on the go, and they'll be, again, connecting from any public Wi-Fi as they're on the go. Our other facets of business, which basically comprise of our pre- and post-production partners, our studio partners, our media device, and our ISP partners, all of these various facets of our business was going to see an equal amount of expansion as well. And to add to the mix, the kind of applications that were built or that were going to be built, not only was it going to see an equal amount of expansion, but the same applications have to be made available outside of the traditional like corporate network. So we clearly had to think in terms of how we imply trust, just here because you're on a corporate network, and how we can detach ourselves to be more aligned in terms of where our actually business is going. Both from a risk perspective, as well as from the cost and the complexity that is involved in setting up the infrastructure and actually maintaining it going forward. So we clearly had to think in a different direction. And this is where we actually started moving towards more of a zero trust model. And last year's talk on Netflix's Lisa program gives you a great insight into our approach in terms of zero trust. And there has been a lot of work done in the industry around zero trust, and Beyond Corp is one very good example as well. So what exactly is zero trust? So the core principle about zero trust is access to any resource, just because it comes from a corporate network, should not imply any trust or privileged access. You should assume like an attacker is already present on your corporate network. You should start detaching trust, which means think of your network as any public Wi-Fi. Think coffee shop. So this basically led to the inception of our identity platform, which we term it as Meacham. The core building block behind the platform is federation. And by federation, I mean we want to federate every single application to our platform, which means the act of authentication and authorization. We want applications to delegate that process out. And applications can actually focus on building the application and let us deal with the stronger authentication and authorization. So this has got a lot of advantages in terms of like how applications actually can start thinking about the platform in general. From an R team perspective, we can adopt standards. Standards is very crucial because we can now have the same authentication and authorization process both for our own built applications as well as third-party SaaS apps. We can layer our security, and at the same time, we can provide the best of the user experiences possible for our end users. From an application developer perspective, they can now focus on actually building the application and let us deal with the stronger authentication and authorization piece. We can give them pluggable security, and at the same time, all of this can be achieved via self-service. What about the end user itself? They can get the best experience via single sign-on. So the core to the platform is the identity itself. What do we know about you as a user who's trying to access any Netflix resource? And when identity is at such a core to the infrastructure, we don't want to be in a situation where we have identity silos. Silos are very problematic to any organization. They pose a huge risk because now we have multiple identities to access multiple applications. Different access or authorization model followed by these silos. And different security practices followed by, again, these silos. And what about the end user? It produces the most confusing experience because people have to remember which identity to actually use. And we cannot have single sign-on also on top of this. So we have streamlined the identity landscape in two different aspects. From an employee and contractor perspective, so we have streamlined the identities to be in the Google's like cloud identity offering. For all other business-to-business use case, which includes our studio partners, our content partners, our ISP, media, and all of the B2B use cases, they are basically managed in our in-house build directory service. But the aspect of streamlining of identities is one aspect. But how do actually identities come in and go out of our ecosystem? And this is where they go through a strong like provisioning and deprovisioning process. And this is very crucial, especially when access to our resources is granted with respect to these identities. So there are three fundamental principles about the provisioning and deprovisioning process. We're going to tap into external event sources. Once we receive those event streams, we're going to take those event streams and propagate the identity and provision them in the right place. Once we have done that, we need to post out notifications, because that's, again, yet another key aspect, so that other applications and services in the ecosystem can actually tap into those notifications and carry out post-processing. But what type of events do we actually tap into? So we tap into HR event sources like the workdays, the ESNs for production use cases. We tap into other B2B use case events, start and end date of a production. It could be start and end date of a vendor contract itself. What about the activity of the user itself? Just because we provision an identity for any user doesn't mean that it lives in our ecosystem forever. So this is where the activity or the user behavior is taken into account. And if there's no activity noticed, then we disable them and get them out of our ecosystem. So streamlining of identities and making sure we have a strong authentication, provisioning and deprovisioning process is one core building block. So how do we start establishing now stronger assurance in terms of who the user is, and is that the user the real user? So at the core of the authentication process is multi-factor auth. So users go through the regular first factor, and a regular cadence, they go through a step-up factor. And step-up, because now we have a range of user base, both here in the US and all across the globe, we have to make sure like the options that we support, they follow like in terms of what the user population is. So we support from security keys to push notifications to your TP and so on. But does all application have same level of risk associated with them when a user is trying to access them? Should we multi-factor auth everyone every single time? That would lead to a very bad user experience. Accessing a lunch menu application, is it really risky versus accessing an application that exposes like some sensitive data? So we really need to think from an attacker perspective in terms of what an attacker might be looking into when trying to actually compromise an account or access any Netflix resource. So this is where we take into the risk level or the risk factor associated with the authentication request itself and make it go through our adaptive authentication process. And there are a lot of core ingredients that actually drive our risk level associated with the request. The first aspect is, what is the likelihood of a user actually going and accessing an application? What are the data points that we have with us? So we have the previous user authentication history in terms of what applications that they have accessed. We have the user's information in terms of what are the, which organization that the user is part of, what are the team that a user is part of, and what kind of applications are those users actually going. So we can come with a nice heuristic in terms of what is the likelihood of a user going to a lunch menu application versus actually a financial application. What about the previous authentication activity itself? So if this is an attacker who has compromised somebody's first factor credential, most likely they are laterally traversing through a range of applications trying to break in. In those cases, they might be blocked at every step of the way with a second factor. So in those cases, there might be a failed authentication request or a bunch of abandoned requests. So can we take that into account and feed that into our adaptive authentication and bump up the risk level? Certain applications, we might want to actually time box, make sure we go through a regular step up. For example, AWS Console, we might want to step you up every 6 hours, versus some other application which actually exposes sensitive data as well. So time boxing applications is also yet another ingredient of our adaptive auth. Every application poses a certain level of risk, and that risk is basically driven in terms of what kind of data that they expose, and what is the sensitivity of that data. So applications can indicate like what kind of data they expose, and that feeds into our adaptive authentication again to drive our risk association. And if you're coming back from the same device that you previously logged in from, we might want to actually bump you up in terms of the confidence level. So device is yet another key ingredient. What about the location from where you're trying to access our applications? If you see that you're coming from very risky locations, in most other cases where we might want to actually step you up, in such cases, especially with respect to location, we might want to outright like deny you. So location plays yet another crucial role in terms of our adaptive authentication. So adaptive authentication is yet another core ingredient for our layered security. What about the health of the device that you're using? Is the device in a healthy state it should be in so that we can grant you access to our resources? So there are a lot of endpoint security software that do a great job in terms of you define a policy, what meets your organization, and you can use that. But with Netflix, things are a bit different, especially our culture around freedom and responsibility. People can walk into any store, pick up any device, and they can actually use it for work. So how do we cater our security in terms of how we want to present or know the health of the device itself? So this is where we built a native application for both Mac and Windows that guides user in terms of what are the best practices that we think in terms of the health of your device. But how can we use this information actually and make it more valuable in terms of how we drive our layered security? So right from the authentication process itself, we query the device and the app to get insight into like what the state of your device is. In this case, it's clearly indicating you that the device is not in a state that we'd like it to be in. We recommend that to the user. Users can actually take appropriate actions, self-corrected, and get a positive confirmation. So it's kind of a win-win situation from both us as a security team as well as from the end user. So, and the best thing about this is like we have actually educated the end user how to make sure that devices are healthy. So health of your device plays a very crucial role in our adaptive authentication as well as into our layered security. So now we have a very strong authentication process that users go through from our federation hub. But how do applications actually wire this up in their application? One common approach that you'll see in the industry is having a mega proxy, where every possible request will go through the mega proxy before it actually reaches the target application. There are a lot of advantages with this particular approach, but there are a few things that we would like to stay away from. One is maintaining or setting up an extra infrastructure and maintaining it. But the most important aspect is we don't want to have single point of failures in our infrastructure. So what we want is we want to push the authentication process like right to the application layer itself. So if you want to reach that end goal, we don't want to be in a situation wherein we have centralized admin or DevOps team that is actually managing all these like various client integrations. This is adding yet another like failure point and slowing us down. So self-service is very crucial. Self-service is great, but it can become another bottleneck if it's not simple and intuitive. And especially when things like authentication and authorization, things can become really complex. So we want to make sure like we present information in the most intuitive and simple way so that we hide all the complexities behind the scene. So we have built an OpenID Connect compliant self-service where developers can actually go and, via one click, they can actually wire up their integrations. And at the same time, we support advanced configuration options where they can actually fine-tune things that they would like to with respect to their configurations. So this is great. Like, so this makes us not be the central point of failure. But how can we spread the integration aspect far-fetched into our ecosystem? And for this, like APIs are very key. And at Netflix, everything is API first. But yet another thing that comes with our ecosystem is freedom, responsibility, is developers can actually pick any language they want, and they can build their applications using that. So one possible way for developers to actually integrate with our platform is we can recommend some open source libraries. They can plug in, or they can go through the configuration aspect. But then we're playing a constant catch-up game in terms of the new languages coming out, new libraries being needed, and we are playing constant catch-up in terms of existing libraries having like vulnerabilities. So how can we move away from this model? One common thing that in Netflix you'll hear is the notion of PayPrude. In a nutshell, what PayPrude gives you is when you're on the PayPrude, you get certain base level things by default. So how can we make use of this to our advantage? When you're on the PayPrude, one of the things that you get is Apache by default. So in this specific case, what we end up doing is we use the ModAuth OpenIDC Apache module to actually wire up those integrations. Another common thing at Netflix is we are 100% AWS. So can we push the authentication right to the load balancer layer itself? So over the year and a half, we have worked very closely with Amazon to have authentications available at the load balancer layer itself. It does support Amazon Cognito, but the best part about this is that you can wire up your own IDP and configure the load balancers accordingly. But we want to spread the integrations and make it one click, far-fetched in our ecosystem. This is where we have integrated like our CI/CD platform, which is Spinnaker, with our identity platform, and other developer and Spring Boot in this case. So a bunch of like other single-click registration with our platform itself. So we have stronger authentication. We have made it easy for people to actually integrate with our platform. But what about access control? Does everyone who are strongly authenticated gets access to every application? Probably might not be a good idea. So right from the same self-service that we have, what we do is we provide base-level access control in which you can actually indicate what are the user or the user groups that actually can access your application. So this becomes very simple in terms of how people actually go about setting it up at the base layer itself. But if this doesn't work, what developers can actually indicate what are the attributes that they would like us to package. So we package these up as an access token and give it to the application itself to apply finer-grained authorization. So the same package information can be applied using other internal like access control applications as well. So in order to protect all these different applications that are coming out in our ecosystem, both that will be accessed by employees and contractors, identity is at the really core of it. And we want to bundle up identity with our adaptive authentication so that we monitor every single authentication request and figure out like the risk level associated with it. And when we need step up users using multi-factor authentication options, and authorization is yet another key ingredient, along with standards. Again, like standards is very important for us to reach to our end state, along with self-service and simpler integrations are all the core ingredients that we need to make identity as the real security parameter. Thank you very much.